Hi, welcome to another edition of Green TV. This is going to be one of my favorites because one of my favorite climate experts and friend from Climate Reality Project, Dan Miller. First, I want to welcome you to Green TV, which, as I've been telling you, is a new platform where we can aggregate all the best expertise, the best solutions, solutionaries, and be a communications bridge to the greater public. A couple of things that I always think of when I hear your name, hear your voice, and that is, I think the first time I met you, you said something about first thing we need to do is apologize to our children for what we've done to our climate, to our planet. And that's when my child, now 27-year-old, was probably, I don't know, maybe 10. And I know what you mean, and I think about that all the time, and I do apologize regularly. Really, we humans are geoengineering our atmosphere and our oceans and all ecosystems right now. So maybe we should get past that fear of what we're already doing. We just weren't quite calling it that. That was an interesting reframe.
Yeah, that was actually Jim Hansen in his latest, in his 2021 temperature update, where he looked back on that and he talked about what we have to do at this point since we let it go way too long. And yeah, so he said that people who are against geoengineering, well, we should have thought of that a long time ago because that's exactly what we're doing. And he said the point of what we have to do now is to reduce our geoengineering of the planet. And there's 3 steps we have to do to make that happen. So I'll just start off with the biggest picture. And that is, one, we have to reduce our emissions to essentially zero as fast as we can. But it turns out we've already put so much CO2 in the atmosphere, about 2.5 trillion tons. And that's, what, by the way, just for reference, weighs more than all life on Earth. So CO2 is the #1 product humans have made in terms of weight. More than cement, more than steel, or more than anything. And we've already put so much up there that even if we could cut our emissions today, which we can't, we would still have too much. For example, the last time CO2 was as high as it is today, and you might know it's measured in parts per million of the atmosphere. And so it's today about 418 parts per million. And the last time it was that high was millions of years ago when sea levels were about 75 feet higher than today. So that kind of means if we stopped emitting today, since CO2, I guess the most important thing to know about CO2, besides it's a greenhouse gas, is it lasts in the atmosphere for hundreds to thousands of years. So it's not like other kinds of pollution that we're used to. Like if you live alongside a river and you like to go fishing and swimming, and then someone builds a chemical plant upstream from you, and therefore water's too polluted to go fishing and swimming, you could fight it, get your friends and neighbors and protest and get them to either clean up the mess or shut down. Once they do that, a year later, you can go fishing and swimming again. But that's not CO2. CO2 is when we stop emitting it,
turn off. You can't turn the faucet off.
No, we can turn off putting it up there, but it's kind of like a bathtub without the drain, right? So you fill up the drain, you stop filling it up, okay, you stop, but it's not going to go down. It's going to stay there.
And we haven't turned off the faucet, and we don't quite know.
The faucet's still running full blast. In fact, we're not turning the faucet down. We're turning it up a little bit every year, which is pretty scary. Mm-hmm. And so people, and that's why the sense of urgency is so high, because if you let it get to the point where you are just so unhappy with how things are going, and there's disasters left and right all the time,
like pretty much
the entire population agrees we should stop doing this, or it's too late. It's too late. You're going to be stuck with that for a really long time. But there's actually an exception to that. I think that's important to know. And this gives me hope about what we can do. So #1, we have to turn off, we have to stop emitting. And there's good news is we can. Now we're not, but we can. We can start. And the good news is that renewable energy, which is emissions free compared to fossil fuels, is cheaper now. And so it's only true in the last 5 years or so. And the good news is it's getting cheaper still, like over time. So not only is it cleaner, it'll be better for the economy if we make the switch as well. So that's good news about, and we can reduce our emissions. #2, what we have to do is we have to remove all the emissions we've already put up there. As Jim Hansen put it, the highest possible safe level of CO2 is 350 parts per million. That's where 350.org name came from, is from from Jim Hanson's statement on that.
And very few Americans know that. Like, have you ever done a
Oh,
random,
yeah.
like on
Well,
the
people
street?
don't know about parts per million of anything. You know, it's
I don't even know about Bill
us, when
McKibben,
you're in climate, you know these things, but we have to remember that the general public doesn't know these things.
which is
But
why
as I mentioned, we're currently at 417. So that means we have to go down. And since CO2 doesn't go out of the atmosphere by itself, we need to remove it. And the good news is that there are technologies available that can do it. They're a very small scale and very expensive today. They're like the one commercial, it's called air capture system or direct air capture system for CO2 is running in Iceland right now, just turned on last year. And it's doing about 4,000 tons a year. And it costs in the order of about $500 a ton. But you know, this is like a hand-built first of a kind thing. If you built a car by hand, it's going to cost a lot more than the car you buy at the shop that makes millions of them. So, so we can scale that up, and we actually have to scale it up by a factor of about 10 million. And so we need like 10 million of those things. And that can be done, by the way. We make 90 million cars a year. We can do it. It would be expensive, but it would be like 10 times cheaper than the $500 a ton. It would be like $50 a ton. And so to remove 40 gigatons a year, to give you reference, that's about as much as we put up there every year. So now imagine we're down to 0. And now what we want to do is we want to go down as fast as we were going up before. And to do that would cost about $2 trillion a year, which sounds like a lot of money, but it's actually a bargain compared to not doing it. Because the choice of the status quo is no longer available to us. So either we make changes ourselves or the changes are made on us by nature, and we will not be happy with that. And so that's the second thing we need to do. But the problem is both of those take time. We're going to say net zero by 2050. So it's like 30 years away. Maybe we can do a little bit faster, still be 20, 25 years away. And then taking 40 gigatons out of the air every year sounds like a lot, but there's 2,500 gigatons up there. So it would take a long time. We need like 40 years to get back to the safe level. And so all those things take decades. And yet we might be crossing tipping points in the meantime. And once you cross a tipping point, it won't matter if you finally decide to cut your emissions or even to take it out of the atmosphere.
There is such a thing as too late.
Looming very, very soon, actually.
Yeah.
So there's one more thing we can do, and that is what's called solar radiation management, which some people call geoengineering, but as we're pointing out, it's actually a way to reduce our geoengineering of the atmosphere. And there's multiple ways to do this, but what we want to do is essentially reflect 1 to 2% of the sun's light away from the Earth. There's three main ways people talk about doing it. A way that would work quite well because it happens naturally is to put sulfur particles high up in the stratosphere. And we know it works because this is what happens when there's a large volcano, not actually bigger than the one we just had in Tonga, like Mount Pinatubo when it blew. It's not only a lot of particles, but it puts it way up high into the atmosphere, so they don't drop out quickly. They stay up for a year or two.
Which this one did not. Tonga did not go high enough. Is that what?
No, they don't think it's going to be. I mean, things could change, by the way. You might end up doing it over time, but there's not enough particles, and then they're not high enough. But you need a lot. It's a big. It's a big volcano, not a regular volcano.
And they're hard to manage. Those volcanoes. They don't listen. They don't take orders very well. Those volcanoes.
They don't.
Like order.
But we can do it ourselves. We can do it artificially.
Okay.
And we know it will be relatively safe because it happens a couple of times a century anyway, and we're still here. And we know it would work because it does work when a regular volcano does it. That's one way. There's another way where you put mirrors on the ground, and it's very safe because it's just mirrors on the ground. But the scale you have to do it to reflect 1 to 2% of the sunlight, it's pretty massive. So it's daunting. And then the other way is to put spacecraft at a certain point between the sun and the Earth called the Lagrange point, where it kind of can park there and stay in orbit, stay between the sun and the Earth at the same place. And you put up a huge solar sail, a solar shield, basically a shade, and you block 1% or 2%. And the nice thing about that is you can control it, turn it on and off, and things like that. And so therefore, if you're not happy with what happens, you can just turn it off and things like that. And also even the putting the particles in the air, if we don't like it, we could just stop doing it. And just like a volcano, it would rain out in the next year or two anyway. So people are really against that. but it's a little bit like being against cancer surgery if you have cancer. I mean, yeah, you could argue that maybe the fact that we have cancer surgery encouraged people to smoke. I kind of doubt it, but people argue that having these kinds of solutions encourage people to keep burning fossil fuels. Well, if that's true, you still have a problem. That means you haven't put policies in place to stop people from burning the fossil fuels. And either we do that or we don't. It's our choice, right? It's not like just something that happens. We're allowing it to happen. So anyway, those three things would keep us safe. And the third thing, that solar radiation management, you only do that for a little while you're doing the other two, while you're bringing your emissions down and while you're taking the CO2 out of the atmosphere. That keeps the Earth cool enough in the meantime so that you don't hit tipping points that will do things like shut down the Gulf Stream and cause not just 1 to 3 feet of sea level rise this century, but maybe as much as 10 feet. In fact, the scary thing is climate scientist Jim Hansen, who is one of the best known climate scientists, and in a sense was the character of Leonardo DiCaprio in the movie Don't Look Up, because he was the guy who went to Congress in 1988 and warned everyone about burning fossil fuels and what would happen with climate change, back at a time when we did not see any climate change. Mm-hmm. And he predicted a whole bunch of things would happen, and all of them have come true already. And he totally nailed the temperature that we would be seeing around now using very limited modeling tools back then. And so he is now saying a very scary thing, actually, that that the IPCC modeling of the ocean is not accurate. It doesn't reflect historical data. And when you plug in the historical data and use that instead, you see that the fresh water melting from Greenland, which is happening right now, can shut down the Gulf Stream in 20, 30 years. And shutting down the Gulf Stream would be mind-boggling. It would, first of all, believe it or not, cool off Europe at a time when global warming is going on, create massive storms, decrease food production in the Northern Hemisphere, increase sea level rise, interestingly enough, along the North American coast, East Coast. And that's not because of the melting water, but that's because of the water that was flowing to the Northern Europe all of a sudden is pooling up on the edge of the North America. And so that's on top of it.
Possibly go wrong.
And then the worst of all, if that happens, is that the warm water that is currently going from the tropics up to Northern Europe to warm it up, and then it gets cooled and comes back down, that would stay in the Southern Ocean and pool around Antarctica. So you would end up with warmer water around Antarctica, which is not a thing you want to do. And that, he says, could lead, even though people don't believe this yet, could lead to 10 feet or more of sea level rise this century, when the IPCC is saying you should just expect 1 to 3 feet, which is also an incredible amount on its own. So he's suggesting, and I totally agree with him, it's probably not a good idea to go there. Because also when you shut down the Gulf Stream, you can't turn it back on again for centuries. So, and we can do it, but so far, and I'm going to quote climate scientist Kevin Anderson on this, we continue to choose to fail. So we have the ability to lower our emissions. We have the ability to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere, although a lot of people don't think it's possible. But again, it's happening right now. So once it exists, it kind of proves it can be done. It is a little expensive now, but just like anything else that you're going to scale up from literally kiloton scale to past megaton scale, all the way to gigaton scale, so 1 million times more, you can always get the price down. Just like solar cells have dropped in price by 99% in the last 30 years because of the scale up of solar panels. We can do similar things for all these other technologies. So the good news is the technology is available, but the political will to implement the technology seems to be lacking.
And let's talk about the political will right now. I mean, Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema are holding up progress for our
the entire Republican Party is holding up progress.
Yeah. Thank you for reminding me, because let them not get off the hook, all 50 of them who are not voting for this. So how significant will it be for all these efforts if it doesn't pass Build Back Better?
Well, actually, maybe I'll be a little contrarian. I'm not sure how much it would really matter, because Build Back Better, while it's all good stuff, and it actually has money for carbon capture, research and deployment to some degree. And it has things like building EV chargers on highways and whatever. So they're very good things. And we shouldn't, ignore that they are good. But it's not even close to what we actually need.
Exactly. So why can't we just get this much done, this little bit done?
So we need like 10x of what we're even talking about. And one of the main things we do need, and it's very simple, it would be probably the single most effective thing we would do, and everyone would like it too, which is kind of weird that we're still not doing it. And that is to put a price on carbon. You put a rising price on carbon, so that the CO2, you put a price on the CO2 content of fossil fuels, and the fossil fuel companies pay that where they extract it. So the well or the mine, or if they import it, the port of entry. And it goes up every year. So everybody knows 10 years from now, it's going to be really high. And then 10 years after that, even higher. And that would raise the price of fossil fuels and everything else that uses fossil fuels. And people in general wouldn't like that. But there's a second part. You then take 100% of the money collected, every penny, and you give it back to every legal resident on an equal basis. And since wealthy people generate far more CO2 than non-wealthy people do, the poor and the middle class, it turns out that the bottom 70% of households, including all the poor, would make more money on what they get paid than what they pay in higher prices at the pump or the grocery store. And so they will actually economically do better, and the rich will pay more, but they won't really care because it's not going to be a lot for them. And the good news is what that does is it makes fossil fuels more truly reflect their true costs to society. Because right now, when you pay, it doesn't include the costs of climate change or even the health impacts.
Not to mention subsidizing the
renewables more cost effective compared to fossil fuels, and will help accelerate the growth, which are still going up. I mean, renewables are doing great, but it's not even nearly fast enough. And this would help it go much faster. So that's an easy thing we could do. We could do it tomorrow. It's predicted that the plan I just described to you would create over 20 years in the US, 2.8 million jobs, grow GDP by 1.4 trillion, save 200,000 lives from reduced pollution, and cut emissions by more than half. There's that one policy. Now we still need all the other policies, but that's a kind of a cornerstone policy that will help all the others as well.
So if all these things would still not do enough, but would be steps in the right direction, what happens if we don't do them? And we seem to be in political paralysis and polarized. And I do mostly blame one party other than Joe Manchin. The Republicans have not been good on climate. Let's just say that, just like they're not good on COVID. They've got a problem with science. Like, we have such an epic challenge that even if we did everything right, as you're pointing out, it still might not be enough. So how can we afford to do everything not at all? I mean, like, we are stuck.
By the way, even though the United States is by far the number one emitter of greenhouse gases in cumulative amount, not on a yearly amount. China's bigger now. But what really matters to climate, since it stays there forever, is the cumulative amount. And by that measure, we are much higher than China. And when you look at the emissions per person, even today, we're much higher than China.
Always been higher.
So we do have this big responsibility to lead the way in fixing climate. But I also have to point out, we're not the only ones. And if the United States brought its emissions to zero tomorrow and no one else did anything, we're still pretty much screwed. So we do need the United States to act, but also we need everyone else to act. And even folks that are considered to be doing a great job, like the EU or the UK, for example, and they are doing far more than we are, and they have a price on carbon, and they just did something called a carbon border adjustment, which is a very interesting thing in its own right. And they're supporting green energy. It's all great, but even they are not even doing close to enough of what we need to do. That is to basically get down to zero emissions as quick as we can, remove the CO2 we put up there, and then also provide some temporary protection in the meantime.
Citizens Climate Lobby was lobbying both sides of the aisle to put a price on carbon. I remember being at a Al Gore training, part of the climate reality updates that he occasionally would have in Nashville, and talking to Marshall Saunders, the guy who started it. about the concept. And I really encouraged it. I said, this is like the best answer, the only solution that I've really heard. And they were really going pretty well. I mean, they had hundreds and hundreds of volunteers. Did they give up, or are they still working just?
No, still around. In fact, what I described, that plan I described, is what Citizens Climate Lobby lobbies for. And they truly are a grassroots organization. And anyone who wants to go to citizensclimatelobby.org can join them and fight for this. It's maybe the number one thing to fight from a policy perspective.
So
Be a little careful. There's versions of the same thing I described to you, one from the Climate Leadership Council, which sounds like it's the same thing, but it's actually supported by the fossil fuel industry. And so the structure is exactly the same, but they changed the numbers so that the price on carbon never gets very high. So they're happy to pay a little tax on fossil fuels, but they don't want to pay a big tax. So they try to co-opt this thing. Stick to Citizens Climate Lobby and you'll be safe. Watch out for the one from Climate Leadership Council.
And then there's Michael Schellenberger, who I've been exchanging emails or on LinkedIn. You know, he wrote "Apocalypse Never" and thinks the future is bright. And I think the future is green or not at all. And therein lies, you know, the problem, that there are people out there who seem to be reasonable, who are saying, don't worry, there's no need to be.
Yeah, so Michael, I debated Michael Schellenberger on stage in Berkeley.
I invited him to come on Green TV for a debate. I think I'll have you be his opponent. I'll be the moderator.
Great, I'd be happy to do it. But Michael Schellenberger, along with Bjorn Lomborg and some other people, are really doing a disservice to humanity, I have to say, by trying to argue that things are okay. I mean, believe it or not, sounds very strange, but Lomborg, and I believe Schellenberger goes along with this, says, oh, we did a cost-benefit analysis because, you know, it costs money to fight climate change, but there's damage from rising temperatures. So we did the numbers, and the perfect number for warming is 3.7 degrees Celsius. Like that would be the quote optimum, which is insane, by the way. I mean, it would be, I don't know what it would be like. Yeah, putting a bullet in your brain is the optimum.
Look what one degree has done. Look what 1 degree has done. Just look at 1 degree has done so far.
Look at 1 degree. Climate scientists tell us 2 degrees is going to be off the charts bad, you know. And I'll give you so 3.7 is pretty close to 4 degrees warming. I'll tell you what climate scientist Kevin Anderson said. I have it memorized. I heard it 10 years ago. About 4 degrees of warming. He said 4 degrees of warming is not compatible with an organized global community. You stop and think about what he means by that.
Like we just saw in Don't Look Up, we're all going to die.
Well, no, it doesn't mean we're all going to die. It's a little different. An organized global community is an organized society. It's government. It's, you know, it's functioning society. It's more like Mad Max. I mean, you might be alive, but it's not going to, you know, it's going to be a little crazy.
You may wish you weren't.
So that was just number one. Number two, beyond adaptation. So people think, you know, just turn the air conditioning up and you'll be okay. Not at 4 degrees. You're not going to be okay. And number three, it's devastating to the majority of ecosystems. So not just us, but everything else is falling apart.
Which we kind of need.
I'm sorry, fourth is it's also not stable. But what it means by that is 4 degrees of warming would cause 5 degrees of warming, and 5 degrees of warming would cause 6 degrees of warming.
The feedback loop.
Yeah, you got feedback loops, and you don't want to go there because it's out of your hands at that point. So that's where Michael Schellenberger and Bjorn Lomborg want to go, which is absolutely crazy. And it's even hard to understand
what planet they have reservations on,
because they're intelligent enough to know that, you know, and there's a whole book, by the way, about Bjorn Lomborg called The Lomborg Deception. I mean, it's a person that is so wrong so often that there's a whole book about how wrong he is.
Arrogance and ignorance is a really bad combination, and it seems to be epidemic in certain circles. And by the way, my comment on Michael Schellenberger, like saying, I don't think so. I'm the only one. Everyone else is kissing as you know what. Go check it out.
No, I don't know about that, but
yeah. Last time I checked yesterday, I was the only one who I don't.
Well, he does come off as being reasonable. He's like the reasonable side of the other.
They were thanking him for being reasonable.
But that's why they're so dangerous. That's why Bjorn Lomborg is so dangerous.
Exactly. So
now that we talked about it, I don't think you're going to get him on the channel anymore.
Well, he said he'd come on, so stay tuned, as we say.
Very good. Okay.
Yeah, we've got to challenge these people because they've got following that are inexplicable.
But there's, by the way, very few of them that argue this because it's so ridiculous. But they do have an oversized impact on the media, because the media is always looking for the other side. And oh, here's someone who presents well on TV and sounds intelligent, so it sounds like a reasonable argument.
And we need some good news.
It's all BS, by the way. There's no truth to any of this. It's and by the way, scientists do read and rebut what they say, and you can look at online how ridiculous.
So this is getting close to Don't Look Up. What did you think of the movie? I have to ask.
Yeah, well, I'm sure, as you know, as people that have been working in climate for over 15 years, we see that all the time. I mean, you can look at my talks from way back when, 2006, 7, 8, and where I mentioned that, what can you do personally? Ask for forgiveness for your children, from your children. Is number one. That was a long time ago, and we haven't done anything since then. In fact, emissions have gone up since then. So here we knew back then, with quite a bit of clarity, that continuing to do what we were doing would cause a lot of harm. And now we're starting to see that harm. So now we're starting to feel sorry about it a little bit, but we're not changing what we're doing. We're still increasing our emissions. And more people feeling bad about it, but the people in control see their short-term, they're only looking for their short-term, the next election or whatever it might be. And either they don't know or they don't care that the decisions we're making today will affect our children and grandchildren for hundreds of years.
Meanwhile, if you watch the morning shows, everything is very chipper and business as usual. And it's
the movie Don't Look Up was all about that.
It was not far-fetched enough, because that's exactly what we're living through right now. I mean, makeup, ambush makeup, whatever, makeovers, like the silliest things. And that's what millions of Americans are watching. And it would make you, if you didn't know as much as we did, and sometimes I wish I didn't know what I know, you feel like everything is normal in America.
Well, I don't think if we fight climate change that we have to ignore other things that are fun. I help restore pinball machines, and so I don't do climate things all the time.
I'm not against fun, but it's at the exclusion of
it's something that we need to pay a lot more attention to than we have.
Yeah,
for sure.
A lot more than the mainstream media networks have been doing, and that's why, again, Green TV is an alternative to that, to show them what they're missing.
Right,
people
but
like Dan Miller.
Politicians kind of know they don't quite have that same excuse, because they get fed information.
Okay, so where are the Republicans on Build Back Better? If that's true, where are they?
No, they're not. I mean, I'm saying that we have a system where special interests can pay for politicians, and they do that. It's very official. It's nothing. It's not considered illegal, and so there's a lot of that happening, and we shouldn't be surprised. But I think what we do need is, since the politicians aren't leading on this issue, we do need to get the public to force the politicians to do what we want. Mm-hmm. And therefore, I think there's things like Extinction Rebellion and Sunrise Movement, where young people are standing up and saying, we don't want to take this anymore, and are fighting harder and harder. And I think we all have to sort of join in different ways to push. And one of the easiest thing to do is the number one thing. I have a TEDx talk on climate change and carbon pricing. You can see on YouTube by searching for Dan Miller Fix Climate, and it should be like the first thing that pops up. Or TEDx, throw TEDx in there, probably would maybe help. And the call to action is to simply talk to everyone you know about climate. Talk to your family, friends, schoolmates, community members, especially elected leaders, and tell them how concerned you are about what's happening with climate. And tell them also that there are simple solutions to simple policies that would put us in the right direction, like putting a price on carbon using what's called the fee and dividend, or the Citizens Climate Lobby approach to doing it. And it's simple, straightforward. We could do it tomorrow.
Why don't we?
Good for the economy, create millions of jobs. It would cut emissions dramatically, and I also think spur and a very exciting technological revolution, because the technologies are available, and the ones that aren't available can be developed. But we need the policies in place that make it so they're not fighting an unfair battle, like those fossil fuels, when they don't have to pay for the pollution they cause. I mean, it's relatively cheaper than other solutions, right? But that's not really fair. And by the way, it's not just a sort of theoretical thing. It means that our economy is not running as good as it could, because those what are called external costs of fossil fuels are real and must be paid. They have to, we pay those fees through paying for weather disasters, paying higher prices for food, paying higher prices for insurance, more uninsured losses when there's a disaster, drought and flood and all these other things that are happening more and more. These are real costs, and they're going to go way up in the future. They already are way up, but so it's not just a theoretical little economic study thing. This is a real thing that will not only reduce the use of fossil fuels, but help the economy at the same time.
So if it's such a no-brainer, why aren't we doing it? It's a win-win-win-win-win, and we need some wins, and it's still not happening.
Well, it's a problem. Maybe I think politicians, including President Biden, who certainly knows about carbon pricing, is a little scared to talk about it because it sounds like a tax, and he wants to stay away from the word tax. Call it fee and dividend. Everyone wants to maintain the status quo as much as they can, but the secret is, and it's not so much of a secret, is that the status quo is not one of the options available to us anymore. As climate scientist Kevin Anderson, I mentioned him earlier, said that we're going to live in a radically different world in the future, either because we choose to make the changes that will protect us from climate change, or we muddle along for a few more years trying to maintain the status quo, and then the status quo gets changed for us by Mother Nature. And Mother Nature doesn't really care what we think about it. We won't negotiate. It's just going to be the way it is.
Do you remember that point in the training with Al Gore? I mean, this was many years ago that we both went through it, but I'll never forget. This was the most dramatic moment. Not anything he said, not his hundreds of slides, when he took off his belt and he held it up in a bell-shaped curve, at least he did in our training, and he held the buckle in one hand and the end of the belt in another, and he was like wiggling it. He said, this is what happens when, like Earth systems are pretty resilient and they can adapt. And until you start moving them too much, manipulating them too much, and all of a sudden, wham, and his belt went flying out of his hand onto the stage with a crash. That was really dramatic. And as we watch what's happening now with all this extreme weather, all kinds of variations on it, new words, fire NATO, snowmageddon, derechos, I keep thinking this is exactly what's happening right now. And Mother Nature, Earth, is just gonna snap and is maybe in the process of snapping. And then what we wish we did more. Right now is the time that we should be doing more. I mean, yesterday was the time we should be doing more, but there's just no time to waste. And yet we're wasting time. I mean, that's
true. But the key is so we know this, and you're right about it, okay? But I've noticed doing this for a long time that there's a really big difference.
You still smile. I like that.
I don't know. It's by the way, it's exciting and inspiring to work on the subject because you realize how important a subject it is. It's kind of fun to be involved. There's so much interesting people. There's interesting technologies. There's so many things that are exciting about it. It can get depressing at times when you realize that there's a big difference between what we must do and what we will do. People think because we must do it that we're going to do it, but that's not true.
As we've seen.
So far, there's a lot of things that we had to do back 40, 30, 20, 10 years ago that we haven't done. And we are now suffering some of the consequences. But I have to say that what we're seeing so far is really just Mother Nature whispering to us about what comes up in the future. And what I mentioned earlier, by the way, which is a little bit more like the comet headed to Earth than like in the movie, is what I mentioned about the Gulf Stream shutting down and the 10 feet plus of sea level rise. 10 feet of sea level rise destroys, almost all the coastal cities in the world, plus island nations and most of Florida. I mean, you can go on and on. It's not a little thing. And by the way, it doesn't stop in 2100, it just keeps going up another 10, 20, 30 feet, in the centuries after that. So that's really a big deal. That's not something we want to deal with. And we have the ability to stop it, but we have to at least start thinking a little bit about the future. And again, people think we have to sacrifice the present for the future. Again, if we put that price on carbon, we create jobs, we grow the economy, we reduce deaths from pollution, plus we cut emissions. So there are win-win-wins, as you like to put it, and we can do those things now. But we're not, and we should be clear that we're not, and that is because people care about climate change. When you poll them, and like 70% say they're worried about it, they care about it, want to do something about it, but they don't vote on it. If they voted on it, then we would have the policies right away, of course. But so it's not important that they put other things ahead of it.
I think that part of the problem is the mainstream media has not connected the dots enough. They're starting to do that in a little bit, but it's just the tip of the melting iceberg. For instance, there are still people I hear in Houston who are out of their homes from Hurricane Harvey who probably voted for Trump. Like, the dots are not being connected enough between political decisions and leadership or lack thereof and the consequences. I mean, if people really understood what was at stake and that climate change is coming for all of us and that nobody is safe from any extreme weather and diseases and there's like nothing good about climate change impacts, I think we would see a change. But I blame in large part, the news leaders, mostly the television networks, for not making this absolutely clear. And the both-siderism that went on for too long. But now that we know what we know, it's still not nearly enough. And I think that's the only way you're going to get the policies to change, is by having the public pressure the politicians to change the policies. And again, that's where media, education, outreach, repeating the same things maybe over and over and over again. It's the environment, stupid. There's no good jobs. There's no good economy. There's no good sports. There's no good nothing on a bad dead planet, right? David Brower, whoever.
But again, we know these things, and this, you're correct. But so far, even though we've said these things for decades now,
ad nauseum,
it hasn't resulted in change. So we have to think about that and figure out why that's so. By the way, in my TEDx talk, there's like a third of it's on the psychology of climate change. And there's also an excellent book, by the way, by my friend George Marshall, called "Don't Even Think About It: Why Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change." And it's like one of the best books on climate change that's not about climate change. It's about us and how we think and things like that. And it's really an interesting book. It goes a lot into this. Like, he went to visit people impacted by Hurricane Sandy, and their homes were destroyed and everything. And from a climate-related disaster, those people did not want to talk about climate change. They wanted to talk about it less than other people did.
It hit New York, the media capital of America. It hit the media capital of the world, and that still didn't change the media, didn't change enough. And yet hurricanes in New York, flooding the subway, like, what about any one of these extreme weather events is not shocking? Are we just so inured to disaster suddenly? Because I remember not so long ago, like 5-10 years ago, where, we knew, because we climate, hawks were obsessed and are obsessed with it. Somebody's got to be, but most of the world didn't feel like there was an existential threat. Now, if you're not feeling that, you're not paying attention. And I would argue too many people aren't. Like, what is it going to take? I know we ask ourselves.
Well, one of the things is to understand that, because some people get disheartened thinking it's too late and there's nothing we can do, the problem's too big. And so just remember the three things we have to do. We have to cut our emissions to zero. We know how to do it, by the way. I mean, not that I'm not saying any of these things are easy, but I would argue, though, that they're easier than not doing them.
and it's going to cost a lot more to not do them. That's the point.
Cost a lot more than not do
them.
It maybe cost everything if we don't do it, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
So we need to cut our emissions. We need to take the CO2 out of the atmosphere that we already put up there. And then we also need to temporarily cool the planet a little bit while we work on the other two things. And all those are doable. We know how to do it. I mean, we need a lot more research on some of them, so don't get me wrong. I mean, it's not like something we run out tomorrow and do them all. But we need the incentives. For example, taking the CO2 out of the atmosphere, we know how to do it. And everyone says, well, why isn't it happening now? And I said, well, who's going to pay you to do it? It's a waste disposal problem. And you do pay, the garbage collection agency to come take the trash from your bins, but no one's paying to remove the CO2. In fact, it's still free to put it up there. So until we put policies in place that make sense for people to implement these things, once we put the policy in place and pay people to remove CO2, we can have as much as we want.
Okay, so and you and I could talk for hours, because we do on Clubhouse. So to wrap it up, and I will have you back, maybe a debate against Michael Schellenberger. I would love to see that. You invest in clean tech innovation. Right. Is there anything on the horizon that you see could really be a game changer if it was properly funded? Well,
a few years down the road, carbon capture is an area we invested in 10 years ago when no one was interested in it. Now there's two kinds. There's the kind that reduces emissions from like cement plants and steel mills and a point source. And then there's the kind that take it out of the atmosphere. Our company focuses on the former, but there are companies working on the air capture that really needs to be done. I'm very excited. I mentioned how excited about the renewable energy getting cheaper and cheaper. It's going to bring a lot of people out of energy poverty. There's energy storage. There's a lot of work going on in energy storage, which again makes renewables easier to implement. Yeah, I'm actually not worried about the technology. I'm worried about having the policies in place. I mean, just for example, with all the renewables we built so far, and we built a lot, almost all of it has gone to supplying new energy demand rather than reducing fossil fuel emissions from the prior energy demand. And what we need to do is get rid of the fossil fuels from all the prior energy demand. And in order to do that, we still need policies in place that ramp it up even faster.
I mean, if we really got the emergency that we're in, if Washington politicians did, shouldn't they be handing out solar panels to put on every rooftop in America, including warehouses, especially in places that are increasingly hotter, like where I live part-time in Texas, with the sun beating down triple digits, in the middle of summer. We were the first home in our neighborhood to put solar panels on. We had to fight the HOA, fight our neighbors at the HOA. We won, but the simple things, putting solar panels on, it doesn't even cost a lot of money out of pocket anymore. Why are we not seeing more of that?
Actually, what I would recommend, if that, put a price on carbon, and then the people would be incentivized to do solar panels because it's going to be cheaper, and that's number one. But the thing that we should have the government pay for is to replace all the gas heaters with heat pumps. Heat pumps are far more efficient. You'll pay a lot less money, but they're electric. So as we move the electric grid to renewables, that would remove natural gas heating, which is a lot of emissions from that. And so that's a hard one, because that, like, every home has a gas heater. And
a
so
gas
that's,
stove.
in Sweden, I believe they're doing that. They're paying to just have everybody replace it. Ithaca, New York is doing it too, by the way, interesting thing. And then UK, they're doing subsidies. But I think in this case, such a big deal, and people are not going to do it otherwise. It'd be, again, way cheaper than not doing it. The cost of not doing it means you will have far more damage from climate change sooner, and will cost us money. And we don't have a choice to not rebuild, from a storm, or how do we deal with drought, and we'll have to build desalination plants to get water. We're going to have to do so many things. But anyway, but to answer your question, I'm very excited about the technologies coming down the road, the ones that are here now. We have everything we need to get started. We do need policies in place that accelerate what's already happening.
EVs, electric vehicles alone, will not save us.
No, EVs.
As encouraging as the trends are.
Yeah, and you got to be careful. Keep in mind that renewable energy does not cause climate change, but it also doesn't stop climate change. It's kind of a weird thing to think about. What causes climate change? I mean, I'm oversimplifying a little bit. There's some other issues like animal agriculture and deforestation are big things too. But burning fossil fuel, about 75% of the problem is burning fossil fuels. And we either stop doing that or we don't. And the fact that you built a lot of solar but did not get rid of the fossil fuels that are burning right now means we haven't solved the problem. So we need to actually put policies in place that actually get us to stop using fossil fuels while promoting renewables, which is great to promote renewables, but it's really not the same thing as getting rid of fossil fuels, as we've seen. So we've promoted renewables, we have more renewables, but we still are increasing our fossil fuel emissions, which is the thing that we should all be worried about. So there's a lot we can do. We have to figure out, and on Green TV, I hope you help figure it out, is we've known about the problem for a long, long time. And we have told people this is what's going to happen if we don't act. It's happening now, and we're still not acting. So we have to figure out what's going on there and get to the root of it, and figure out how to engage with people in such a way that they demand that their policymakers actually do something, and they vote on this issue. That has to be something that happens as well. And if we do that, then I'm actually quite optimistic about what we could do. I mean, we're already seeing bad impacts, so we can't avoid bad impacts. And it's going to get worse before it gets better. But as I tell people, it can get way worse than bad if we don't act. And we will not be happy. No one will be happy if we let that happen. And the good news is it will help the economy. It'll create jobs. We'll have cleaner air. I mean, there's really no downside to addressing this.
Versus, the end.
Versus the end, or something that will be, you might wish for the end if you don't have the end. But again, people will always argue, but it costs too much to do it. But it's a ridiculous argument for a number of reasons.
Just like it'll cost jobs. No, it'll create jobs. I mean, that's
So
a
first of all, it's not even true. Again, the cost of action,
never been true.
and every study shows this to be true. The cost of action is a small amount compared to the cost of inaction.
Okay.
So the choice of the status quo no longer exists. That's not, we can't just have it the way it was without doing things. So we need to act, and we need that very soon. So anyway, I really appreciate the time.
It's been wonderful. We didn't even get into fracking or whether you think the COVID pandemic has helped our cause or hurt it. And I sort of see both sides of that. Have to have you back, Dan Miller. You're just—
Well, the one thing I'll say about COVID, and I said when it first happened, is the thing about COVID, which may be helpful, is people now understand that everything can be okay one day,
exactly.
and then not okay the next day.
South.
That was hard to believe before COVID, that our way of life could change in a bad way.
Across the
and
entire
COVID's
globe.
Temporary.
Overnight.
COVID's a temporary thing, but it's going to be, long-term problem for climate. And it's the same thing. Even though there might be a nice day today, what's coming down the pike if we don't act, and I'm not talking about long in the future, this is something we all will see accelerate, and our children will live through it. So anyway, lots of reasons to take action, no reasons to remain inactive. Let's figure out how to do it.
Yeah, and there's so many parallels between personal behavior having public impact, like what you drive and what you eat and how you build and who you vote for, all those things. But with COVID, it should be simpler. Wear a mask, get vaccinated. The fact that we haven't even mastered that does not bode well for our hopes to address climate change. Thank you so much, Dan Miller. I'll see you on Clubhouse. Please tell everyone
all you're doing there, Betsy. Appreciate
We're
it.
just shining the spotlight on people like you whose wisdom and experience should be widely heard and seen. That's what we believe in. So thank you for being.
Very good. Thank you.
We want to invite everybody to go to greentv.com and subscribe. The more subscribers we get, the sooner we can go live and expand our coverage and become 24/7, because what is more important than talking about how we're going to save ourselves? Not the planet. The planet will be fine. It's us. We need Mother Nature more than she needs us. If you need explanation on that, stay tuned to Green TV. Thanks.